Everyone mocked the waitress for helping an old woman, until they discovered she was the billionaire's mother. The quickest way to learn who people truly are is to watch how they treat someone they believe has nothing to offer. On a cold autumn evening in downtown Chicago, the dining room of the Grand Regent glowed beneath crystal chandeliers and soft golden light. Expensive suits filled the room. Luxury watches flashed beneath polished sleeves. Conversations about investments, real estate, and private flights drifted through the air. It was the kind of restaurant where reservations were booked months in advance and appearances seemed to matter almost as much as money. Near the entrance, an elderly woman slowly stepped inside. Her gray coat looked worn from years of use. Her shoes were practical rather than fashionable. She carried a small handbag and moved carefully, as if every step required a little extra effort. A few guests glanced at her before quickly looking away. Others stared longer, not because she was causing trouble, simply because she looked out of place. The hostess forced a polite smile. A businessman near the bar whispered something to his companion. Both laughed quietly. The old woman seemed to notice. She lowered her eyes and tightened her grip on her purse. Across the dining room, Emily Parker balanced a tray of drinks as she moved between tables. 27 years old. Blonde hair neatly tied back. Simple black apron over a white shirt. Calm eyes that noticed details most people ignored. She saw the elderly woman standing alone near the entrance. She also saw something else. No one wanted to help her. Emily handed off the tray to another server and walked toward the woman. "Can I help you find a table, ma'am?" she asked gently. The woman looked surprised. For a second, it seemed as if she had expected another rejection. "I was told there might be a cancellation tonight," she replied quietly. Emily smiled. "Let me check." While the hostess hesitated and searched through reservations, Emily noticed the woman's hands trembling slightly from the cold. Without saying a word, she disappeared into the kitchen and returned moments later carrying a steaming cup of tea. "Here," she said softly. "This will help warm you up." Several nearby guests noticed immediately. One woman rolled her eyes. Another customer smirked. A man in an expensive gray suit laughed openly. "Look at that," he muttered. "She is treating her like royalty." A few people chuckled. Emily heard them. She ignored every word. The elderly woman wrapped both hands around the warm cup. "Thank you," she said. There was genuine gratitude in her voice. Emily pulled out an empty chair beside a small table near the window. "Please sit down while we figure everything out." The woman smiled for the first time since entering the restaurant. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the glass. Inside, whispers continued spreading through the dining room. Some guests watched with amusement, others with annoyance. To them, the old woman was simply someone who did not belong. But Emily never once looked embarrassed. She sat beside her for a moment and asked about her evening. And as laughter echoed from nearby tables, neither of them noticed that the first chapter of a story nobody in that restaurant would ever forget had already begun. The hostess finally found a small table that had not been reserved for the evening. It sat near the window, away from the center of the dining room where the wealthiest guests preferred to be seen. Emily guided the elderly woman there with the same care she would have shown any customer. The woman settled into her chair and looked around quietly. For a moment, she seemed almost relieved simply to have a place to sit. Emily handed her a menu. "Take your time, ma'am. There is no rush." The woman smiled warmly. "You are very kind." Emily shrugged gently. "I am just doing my job." The woman looked at her for a second longer than expected. "No," she said softly. "You are doing more than that." Before Emily could respond, another server approached carrying a tray of sparkling water. He lowered his voice. "The manager is not happy." Emily glanced toward the front of the restaurant. The manager stood near the reservation desk, watching the situation unfold with obvious frustration. Several important clients had already noticed the elderly woman. A few had complained. Emily thanked the server and returned to work. Yet she could feel the eyes following her. Throughout the next half hour, whispers drifted across the dining room. One couple complained that the woman looked homeless. Another customer suggested she was making the restaurant seem less exclusive. Each comment revealed more about the speakers than the woman they judged. Meanwhile, Emily continued serving tables. Every few minutes she checked on the elderly guest, refilled her tea, brought fresh bread, asked whether she needed anything. The old woman seemed touched by every small gesture. Eventually, Emily returned with a bowl of soup. The woman's hands brightened immediately. "That looks wonderful. It is our chef's favorite recipe," Emily replied. "Then perhaps I chose wisely." They both laughed. The sound caught the attention of several nearby diners. One woman shook her head in disbelief. "Imagine spending $200 on dinner and sitting next to that." Her husband chuckled. The old woman heard them. Emily saw it in the slight lowering of her eyes. For a brief moment, sadness crossed her face. Emily immediately pulled out a chair and sat beside her. The dining room seemed to freeze. Employees were not supposed to sit with guests, especially during dinner service. Emily did not care. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly. The woman nodded. "I am used to it." That answer hurt more than any complaint. Emily studied her carefully. There was dignity in the woman's posture, intelligence in her eyes, grace in the way she carried herself. None of it matched the assumptions being made around the room. "People can be unkind when they think someone is different," Emily said. The woman smiled sadly. "Or when they think someone is unimportant." Emily looked directly at her. "Everyone matters." The woman seemed surprised by the certainty in her voice. Outside, the rain grew heavier against the windows. Inside, the restaurant remained warm and bright. Yet for the first time all evening, the elderly woman's smile looked genuine. Neither of them noticed the manager walking toward their table. His expression suggested that the situation was about to become much more uncomfortable. The manager stopped beside the table and forced a smile that never reached his eyes. "Emily, may I speak with you for a moment?" His tone sounded polite, but she knew what it meant. "Of course," she replied. She stood and followed him a few steps away from the table. The elderly woman lowered her gaze toward her tea, pretending not to listen. The manager folded his arms. "Several customers have complained." Emily glanced around the dining room. She already knew which customers he meant. The ones who had spent the evening whispering and staring. "Complained about what?" she asked calmly. The manager sighed. "About the situation." Emily waited. He continued. "They think she is making guests uncomfortable." For a moment, Emily simply stared at him. "The situation? You mean an elderly woman eating dinner?" The manager looked irritated. "Emily, do not make this difficult. We have a reputation to protect." The words hung heavily between them. Across the room, several diners watched openly. Some appeared curious. Others seemed eager to see what would happen next. Emily lowered her voice. "She paid for her meal. She is not bothering anyone." The manager glanced toward the table. "That is not the point." "Then what is the point?" The question caught him off guard. Before he could answer, a wealthy customer stood from a nearby table and approached them. His expensive suit probably cost more than Emily earned in a month. He smiled, but there was no warmth behind it. "Is there a problem?" he asked. The manager immediately became more polite. "We are handling it, sir." The man nodded toward the elderly woman. "Good. Because some of us came here for a certain atmosphere." Emily knew exactly what he meant. The manager remained silent. The customer looked at her. "You seem like a nice girl, but not everyone belongs in places like this." Emily felt a wave of disappointment. Not anger, disappointment. The man genuinely believed what he was saying. She looked toward the elderly woman sitting quietly by the window. Rain traced patterns down the glass behind her. She looked smaller now, not because anything had changed, because the room had decided she was. Emily turned back toward the customer. "I think everyone deserves a place to eat dinner with dignity." The man's smile disappeared. Several guests exchanged looks. The manager looked horrified. Emily had said out loud what nobody wanted to discuss. The customer shook his head and returned to his table. The whispers immediately resumed. Louder this time. The manager rubbed his forehead. Emily, please, just focus on your section. I will handle this. Emily nodded politely, but she already knew what that meant. As she returned to the table, the elderly woman offered a gentle smile. Trouble? She asked. Emily sat down briefly beside her. Nothing important. The woman studied her face. You defended me. Emily shrugged. I defended what was right. The woman looked out at the rain before speaking again. Most people stop doing that once it becomes uncomfortable. Emily smiled softly. Then maybe more people should be willing to feel uncomfortable. For the first time all evening, the elderly woman laughed openly. It was a warm, genuine laugh. And strangely enough, it seemed to irritate certain people in the restaurant even more. The laughter gradually faded, but the judgment remained. Emily could feel it every time she crossed the dining room. Guests who had never spoken to her before suddenly seemed eager to share their opinions. Some did it openly. Others hid behind polite smiles. The elderly woman, however, appeared completely unaffected. She sipped her tea, enjoyed her soup, and watched the rain beyond the window as if the rest of the room barely existed. Emily found herself admiring that. Most people would have left by now. Most people would have allowed embarrassment to drive them away. Yet this woman remained calm. There was a quiet strength about her that did not fit the image everyone had created. A little later, Emily returned carrying the main course. The woman thanked her and immediately complimented the aroma. Emily laughed softly. You are making our chef sound like a genius. Maybe he is, the woman replied with a smile. Emily pulled out a chair for a brief moment while the restaurant slowed between orders. The woman gestured toward the empty seat. Sit for a second. Emily hesitated. Employees were not supposed to do that. Then again, she had already broken several unwritten rules that evening. She sat. For a few moments, they simply talked. The woman spoke about books she loved, cities she had visited years ago, the beauty of people watching from park benches and coffee shops. Her stories were thoughtful and surprisingly funny. Emily found herself smiling more than she had all week. You have lived quite a life, she said. The woman looked down at her plate. Long enough to learn a few things. Like what? The woman glanced around the restaurant. Like how quickly people decide who deserves respect. Emily followed her gaze. Several customers immediately looked away when they realized they had been noticed. The woman smiled sadly. Most people see clothing before character. Emily nodded. That happens more often than it should. The woman studied her carefully. And yet you did not do that. Emily shrugged. My father used to tell me something when I was little. The woman leaned forward slightly. What was it? Emily smiled. He said every stranger is carrying a story you cannot see. The woman's eyes softened. A wise man. He was. For a moment, silence settled comfortably between them. Not awkward silence. The kind shared between people who understand each other. Then the woman asked a question that seemed oddly serious. Emily, if I truly had nothing, would you still be sitting here? Emily looked surprised. Nothing? No money. No influence. No important family. No connections. Just an old woman alone in a restaurant. Emily answered without hesitation. Of course. The woman searched her face as if looking for any sign of dishonesty. She found none. Why? She asked quietly. Emily glanced around the dining room once more. Because none of those things determine a person's worth. The answer seemed to affect the woman more deeply than expected. She lowered her eyes for a second and smiled. Outside, the rain continued falling. Inside, neither woman noticed the black luxury vehicles beginning to arrive at the front entrance of the restaurant. The atmosphere inside the Grand Regent began to change long before anyone understood why. It started with a few employees glancing toward the front windows. Then the valet staff outside suddenly became unusually attentive. Conversations near the entrance slowed. Several guests discreetly turned their heads toward the street. Emily noticed none of it. Her attention remained on the elderly woman seated by the window. The woman had just finished her meal and seemed content for the first time all evening. The tension that had surrounded her upon arrival had faded. In its place was a quiet warmth that made her appear years younger. Emily was clearing a nearby table when the manager approached again. This time his expression looked far more nervous than irritated. He kept checking his watch. Then he looked toward the entrance. Then back toward the dining room. Something was clearly happening. One of the servers hurried over. "There are several luxury vehicles outside," he whispered. The manager immediately straightened his tie. "Important guests?" he asked. "Very important," the server replied. The manager's entire posture changed. Across the restaurant, customers had started noticing as well. People sitting closest to the windows leaned slightly toward the glass. Rain reflected across a line of black vehicles parked along the curb. Their headlights cut through the evening darkness. The elderly woman quietly observed the reaction around her. Then she looked at Emily. "It seems something interesting is happening." Emily smiled. Apparently, the woman folded her hands together. "Tell me something." Emily paused. "What is that? Have you always been this kind?" The question caught her off guard. Emily thought for a moment. "Not always. I try to be." The woman nodded thoughtfully. "That is more difficult than people realize." Before Emily could answer, a raised voice interrupted from across the dining room. The wealthy customer in the gray suit had returned to complaining. "This is ridiculous," he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Some of us are paying premium prices for dinner." The manager immediately hurried over. "Of course, sir. We appreciate your patience." The customer gestured toward the elderly woman. "Then perhaps you should start acting like this is a premium establishment." The room fell quiet. Several guests looked uncomfortable. Others seemed eager to watch. Emily felt her stomach tighten. Not because of what was being said. Because of who it was being said about. The elderly woman remained remarkably calm. She simply looked down at her empty teacup. Emily stepped forward before the manager could respond. She had no intention of allowing the woman to sit alone through another public humiliation. "If there is a problem, sir, I would be happy to help," Emily said politely. The customer laughed. "You already have. You have spent half the evening babysitting her." Emily held his gaze. She did not raise her voice. She did not become angry. She simply stood there, calm, composed, unmoving. For a brief moment, the entire restaurant seemed suspended in silence. Then the front doors opened. Cold air swept inside. Every head in the dining room turned toward the entrance. And suddenly, nobody was looking at Emily anymore. The man who entered the restaurant did not need an introduction. Recognition spread through the room almost instantly. Conversations stopped. Chairs shifted. Even the wealthy customer in the gray suit fell silent. Jonathan Hayes walked through the entrance with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention without asking for it. Tall, impeccably dressed. Known throughout Chicago as one of the most successful businessmen in the country. The manager's face immediately transformed into a smile. He hurried forward. "Mr. Hayes, what an honor. We were not expecting you this evening." Jonathan barely seemed to hear him. His eyes moved across the dining room, searching for someone. Behind him, several associates remained near the entrance. The valet staff stood straighter. Employees exchanged nervous glances. Customers whispered excitedly. Everyone knew who Jonathan Hayes was. What nobody understood was why he looked so concerned. Emily watched from across the room. She had seen his face before on magazine covers and financial news programs. Yet something felt different now. He was not looking around like a powerful man enjoying attention. He looked like someone searching for a loved one. Jonathan continued scanning the room. Then he saw her, the elderly woman near the window. For a moment, relief washed across his face. Real relief. The kind that could not be faked. Without acknowledging anyone else, he walked directly through the dining room, past the manager, past the customers, past every table that would normally compete for his attention. The room remained completely silent. Emily turned toward the elderly woman. She had already risen from her chair. A gentle smile appeared on her face. Jonathan reached her table and immediately wrapped his arms around her. "Mom," he said softly, "I have been calling you for an hour." The silence became absolute. Several guests stared as if they had misheard him. The manager blinked. The customer in the gray suit looked frozen. Emily felt the entire room change in a single heartbeat. The elderly woman laughed warmly. My phone battery died. Jonathan shook his head and smiled. You worried me. Then he noticed the empty teacup, the finished meal, the comfortable expression on his mother's face. He looked around the table. Someone has been taking good care of you. His mother nodded immediately. A wonderful young woman. Jonathan followed her gaze. For the first time, he noticed Emily standing nearby in her black apron. Their eyes met briefly. Emily offered a polite smile and looked away. To her, he was simply a customer greeting his mother. But everyone else in the restaurant had already begun piecing together what had happened. Every whisper, every judgment, every cruel assumption. The realization spread across the room like a wave. The woman they had dismissed all evening was not helpless. She was not out of place. She was Eleanor Hayes. And suddenly, nobody seemed quite as confident as they had an hour earlier. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The dining room that had been filled with whispers now felt almost silent. The wealthy customer in the gray suit stared at Eleanor Hayes as though he were seeing an entirely different person. The manager looked as if every decision he had made that evening was replaying inside his head. Emily remained beside her section, holding an empty tray, unaware that she had become the center of attention. Jonathan pulled out a chair and sat beside his mother. Are you all right? He asked. Eleanor smiled warmly. I am better than all right. Jonathan studied her expression. The concern in his face slowly faded. Then he noticed something unusual. His mother looked genuinely happy. Not polite. Not composed. Happy. That caught his attention immediately. What happened? He asked. Eleanor glanced across the room toward Emily. Jonathan followed her gaze again. The young waitress was helping another table as if nothing extraordinary had happened. She had no idea the entire restaurant was watching her. Eleanor folded her hands together. That young woman happened. Jonathan looked confused. His mother smiled. She treated me like a person. The simple sentence carried more weight than anyone nearby expected. Jonathan remained silent. Eleanor continued. She brought me tea when I was cold. She sat with me when others laughed. She defended me when people wanted me gone. Around the room, several guests suddenly found great interest in their plates and wine glasses. Jonathan slowly turned toward the manager. The manager immediately stepped forward. Mr. Hayes, I can explain. Jonathan raised a hand politely. There was no anger in his expression. Somehow that made the manager even more nervous. Explain what? Jonathan asked calmly. The manager hesitated. He glanced around the room. Nobody seemed eager to help him. Eleanor answered before he could. Some people believed I did not belong here. Jonathan's eyes moved from table to table. The room grew even quieter. He did not need anyone to confess. The discomfort on their faces told him enough. Then Eleanor smiled again and pointed toward Emily. But she never did. Jonathan watched Emily for several seconds. She was speaking kindly to an elderly couple at another table, completely unaware of the impact she had made. Most people changed their behavior when they recognized someone important. Yet according to his mother, Emily had shown kindness before she knew who Eleanor was. That detail mattered, more than any apology ever could. Jonathan stood and walked across the dining room. Several customers followed him with their eyes. Emily turned when she noticed him approaching. Is there anything else I can help you with this evening, sir? She asked professionally. Jonathan smiled. Actually, yes. Emily waited. My mother tells me you were the only person who treated her with kindness tonight. Emily looked surprised. I was only doing what anyone should do. Jonathan glanced around the restaurant. Judging by tonight, that appears to be rarer than it should be. For the first time all evening, the people who had mocked Eleanor felt something they had not expected to feel. Not fear. Not embarrassment alone. Something deeper. The uncomfortable realization that the waitress they had quietly judged possessed far more character than many of the people sitting in the most expensive seats. Emily felt dozens of eyes on her, yet she resisted the urge to look around the room. Attention had never interested her. She simply wanted to finish her shift and make sure every customer was treated well. Jonathan's words lingered in the air long after he spoke them. Several guests who had spent the evening mocking Eleanor now seemed eager to avoid eye contact altogether. The manager stood nearby, uncertain whether to apologize, remain silent, or disappear completely. Eleanor watched everything unfold with quiet wisdom. She had lived long enough to recognize the difference between genuine respect and respect motivated by status. Jonathan pulled out a chair beside his mother's table and sat down. For a few moments, neither he nor Eleanor spoke. They simply enjoyed being together. Then Eleanor glanced toward Emily once more. "There is something you should know," she said. Jonathan listened carefully. "I never told her who I was." Jonathan smiled. "I assumed as much." Eleanor shook her head. "No, you do not understand. She treated me kindly when everyone else believed I had no value. That is different." Jonathan looked around the dining room. His mother's words struck harder than any business lesson he had learned. In his world, people often changed their behavior the moment they recognized influence or wealth. Yet Emily had offered compassion before she knew any of those things. Nearby, the wealthy customer in the gray suit slowly approached the table. His confidence from earlier had completely disappeared. He cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mrs. Hayes, I believe I owe you an apology." Eleanor looked up at him. Her expression remained gentle. The man shifted uncomfortably. "I made assumptions I should not have made." Eleanor smiled kindly. "We all make assumptions. The important question is whether we learn from them." The man nodded quietly and stepped away. Across the room, several other guests seemed equally uncomfortable. One couple who had laughed earlier now avoided looking toward Eleanor entirely. Another customer asked a server for the check much sooner than planned. The atmosphere had transformed. Not because a billionaire had entered the room, because the truth had exposed everyone's character. Jonathan eventually stood and walked over to Emily again. She had resumed her work as though nothing extraordinary had happened. That impressed him even more. Most people would have tried to capitalize on the moment. Emily simply continued serving customers. Jonathan smiled. "My mother says you believe everyone matters." Emily looked slightly embarrassed. "I suppose I do." Jonathan nodded thoughtfully. "That belief is becoming rare." Emily considered his words. "I do not think it is rare. I think people forget it when life becomes busy." Jonathan found himself smiling. His mother laughed softly from across the room. "The two of you sound far too similar." Emily laughed as well. The tension that had filled the restaurant all evening finally began to dissolve. Outside, the rain eased into a gentle drizzle. Inside, warm light reflected across the windows. For the first time since arriving, Eleanor looked completely at peace. And as Jonathan watched his mother smiling beside the waitress who had shown her unexpected kindness, he realized something important. Emily had not changed because she discovered who Eleanor was. She had remained exactly the same person from the beginning. That was what made her extraordinary. The evening slowly returned to normal, but something inside the Grand Regent had permanently changed. The laughter was gone. The judgment was gone. Even the air felt different. Guests who had arrived expecting an ordinary dinner found themselves quietly reflecting on everything they had witnessed. Jonathan remained at his mother's table while Emily finished her shift. Every now and then, Eleanor would smile in her direction, and Emily would smile back. Nothing more was needed. Near closing time, Jonathan approached the service station where Emily was organizing receipts. The restaurant had grown quieter. Most customers had already left. Rain still shimmered against the windows, turning the city lights into soft streaks of gold and silver. Jonathan held a business card in his hand. "I would like to thank you properly," he said. Emily smiled politely. "There is no need. I was happy to help." Jonathan nodded. "That is exactly what my mother said you would say." Emily laughed softly. Then she noticed he was serious. Jonathan placed the card on the counter. "If you ever need anything, call me. A recommendation, career advice, an opportunity, anything." Emily looked at the card but did not pick it up immediately. Instead, she glanced toward Eleanor, who was watching from across the room with a knowing smile. Finally, Emily took the card. "Thank you." Then she surprised him. "There is actually something I would ask for." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Name it." Emily thought for a moment. "There is a senior community center a few miles from here. Many of the people there spend holidays alone. Some barely receive visitors all year. They could use support. Meals, programs, transportation." Jonathan stared at her for a second. Most people presented with a chance like this would have asked for themselves. Promotion, a better apartment, a financial reward. Emily had asked for strangers. Jonathan slowly smiled. "Consider it done." Eleanor's eyes filled with pride. Not because of her son, because of Emily. The manager, who had spent most of the evening regretting his behavior, quietly stepped forward. "Miss Parker, I owe you an apology." Emily looked at him kindly. "You do not owe me anything." "Yes, I do. I forgot something important tonight." Emily waited. The manager lowered his eyes. "I forgot that hospitality is supposed to begin with humanity." Emily offered a gentle smile. "Then perhaps tonight was useful for all of us." The restaurant fell silent once more. Not an uncomfortable silence. A thoughtful one. A meaningful one. As Eleanor prepared to leave, she walked over to Emily and took both of her hands. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" Emily asked. "For treating me the same before and after you knew my name." Emily felt a lump rise in her throat. Eleanor squeezed her hands gently and smiled. Then she turned and walked toward the exit beside her son. Together they disappeared into the rainy Chicago night. Emily watched them leave. Then she returned to her work, just as she always did. Because nothing about her kindness had depended on who Eleanor Hayes was. And perhaps that was the lesson everyone carried home that night. Wealth can reveal status. Power can command attention. But character reveals itself in the moments when there is nothing to gain. The true measure of a person is not how they treat the important. It is how they treat the invisible.